Today, we begin a chapter titled Human Variation, Chapter 3. Before we talk about human variation, I want to talk about human similarity. The textbook says we are 99.9% genetically the same. Some people think it's more like 99.6% or 99.5%. It's very high, over 99% genetically the same. We've been, as human beings, one continuous interbreeding species for about at least 100,000 years. And what that means is that you take people from different parts of the world, way different parts of the world, put them together, and if the people are of reproductive age and reproductively inclined, they can all reproduce and have viable offspring, and those offspring will be able to reproduce and have more viable offspring. We know this not just hypothetically, but because humans move around a lot. We're a species that tends to migrate and move from place to place, and we've been doing that for a long time, spread out all over the world, and then get back together in various combinations, even after years, maybe even after thousands of years have gone by. They might not like each other all the time, they might fight each other, but they can always get together, reproduce, and have viable offspring, no matter how different they look to each other. And it's funny because some species that we look at, like penguins or other species of primates, look very much the same to us, but are more genetically varied. We're pretty genetically uniform as a species. When we look around the room, when we look around Hartwick College, when we look around the world, we might be tempted to wonder about this. I certainly would if I were you. It's like look around, check out your neighbors and be like, really? Really? We're so the same? How is that possible? This is the key issue of this chapter, is that if we're all the same, if we're 99% the same genetically and we all reproduce with each other, why is it that when you look at people from different parts of the world, different regions, or even in the same region, sometimes in the same family, people are so physically different from each other? We're not going to minimize that. People have all kinds of physical variations, some of which we can see, a lot of physical variations that we can't see. We are physically different. How is this possible if we are so genetically similar? The answer is stated several times in your text. The first time they state it is hidden. It's on page 51, but it's in a little side note. I'll be saying this in various ways as we go through, but it's just a very important idea, is that the reason we look different from each other is because of relatively recent evolutionary adaptations to the kinds of environments that people spread out to in the last 30,000 years. Or in evolutionary time scale, we're going to be talking about tens of millions of years or millions of years. Hundreds of thousands of years in evolutionary time is not very much. But the kinds of stuff we're talking about is like the kinds of stuff that developed in the last 30,000 years, 10,000 years, in some cases, less than 5 or 7,000 years when you're talking about things like lactose tolerance as a form of variability. This is something that has happened relatively recently. Not only is this a recent evolutionary change, it's a change to more to the visibility part, the phenotype, than it is to genotype. So now we're talking some biology, and we need to get into some biology to understand how and why this works. So our first big biology terms are going to be the genotype and the phenotype. So a genotype there's all that stuff you had to learn, the gene stuff, the genetic stuff, the letters, C, G, A, T, and how they string together to make the genetic code. The phenotype are the physical traits that are sometimes a result of that genotype, but they might be the result of how you grow up in a certain environment, what food you eat. So your phenotype is what you end up looking like and physically. And this is partly genetic, but it's also shaped by your environment. And the more we understand about the genetics, the more we understand that the environmental factors can turn off and turn on different genes depending on where you are and what the conditions are. So there's a dynamic interaction between the genotype and the phenotype. But in human beings, we can have fairly large physical changes without having large genetic changes. If you take, for example, identical twins, and you seriously separate them, you have one raised in the Tibetan highlands at 10,000 feet of altitude, and we'll put another on the Venezuelan coast down in the tropics and feed them the different food from those parts of the world, and they get exposed to the different sunlight in different areas. It's not that they will look like the people necessarily who were born in those areas. Those people have their own adaptations that they've developed to that, and it could be slightly different over time, but they will grow up looking very different. Their bodies will be different, their height will be different, their skin will be different. We can change a lot both during our lifetime and by the things we do. Our phenotypes change quite a bit without necessarily corresponding to a large change in our genotype. Human beings are especially what we refer have a lot of what we call phenotypic plasticity. That is, we're very malleable to changes in our environment. For example, height is very malleable depending on how much nutrition and what kinds of nutrition you have. You might have the same genetics, but end up with very different heights for your own children. So this is an important part to realize about human beings. So let's go into those genes a little bit. Remember what these things are called? Yeah, the Punnett square. So here we have dimples. So let's all smile and look at our neighbors and see if they have dimples, and then we can decide who their parents were. So let's say your parent has dimples, but one of your parents has two dominant dimple genes, and the other parent doesn't have dimples, and they have two recessive genes. You are doomed to have dimples whether you like them or not because of that one dominant parent. And then we get what they call the heterozygous combination. So let's say both parents have one dominant, then you're going to have those 3/4 of the children are going to have dimples, and then there'll be that one weird person, and they'll probably wonder where that kid came from. So phenotypically, we have a difference between what is manifested genotypically. What I really want to talk about is why that matters, why we learn what is dominant and what is recessive, and why does it matter that the next generation, even if you don't have dimples necessarily, or even if you can have kids that don't have dimples and those recessive genes might be passed along even if they're not part of the phenotype. Why does that matter? Let's say we didn't do it this way. Let's say instead of doing it, it was like we believed in the olden days that when you had one can of paint that was red and one can of paint that was white, if you mixed them together, it would just all be pink in the next generation. So whatever traits you had, you just blended together, and over time, you just got this nice blend. If we just blended together and all that variation disappeared, right? If you didn't have the possibility of popping that back up in the next generation, then evolution would have nothing to work on because the whole process of selection depends on a preservation of some variation. And if we all just blended together and all started to look exactly the same and have the same traits, then there's nothing to change, or in evolution it wouldn't work very well. This whole dominant and recessive thing comes from what is called the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory. The modern synthesis of evolutionary theory puts together two people who did not know each other when they were alive and researched in separate places, but after they died, people put their ideas together. Charles Darwin, who gave us the idea of the mechanism of natural selection, which we've obviously been talking about a little bit. And then Gregory Mendel, who gave us some of the mechanisms of inheritance and was working with those pea plants, and then in some ways discovered, before we had genetic codes, this idea of dominant and recessive traits and how they change in each generation. If Mendel's pea plants, if he planted the tall pea plants and the short pea plants, and they all came out medium from generation to generation, then evolution has no place to go. Then they're all going to be medium, and we have nothing to select for. Darwin and the people around Darwin did not know about the mechanisms of inheritance. They thought it was blended together. But when it was combined with Mendel's ideas about it gave, and especially with sexual reproduction, it became obvious that there was much more material to work on for evolution because certain traits, although they might not be physically apparent, were still lingering around in the genetic code. Now, one of the issues is that they talk about in this chapter, yeah, in biology, we have learned that especially among human beings, that the whole idea that there's just two genes for a trait or a single gene with two alleles is not true for most of our traits. And the more we learn about genetics and the more we learn about phenotype and genotype, the more we have learned how very few human traits, especially, follow the simple dominant recessive model. Your book gets way into this in ways that are probably more complicated than any of us want to know. But the point of the matter is that most human traits are what we call polygenic. They are influenced by many different genes. And so, as we've heard, if you get together two people who look very different from each other, your offspring are going to look like and different from each other in complicated ways because things like skin color and even eye color are determined by multiple sets of genes. They're multifactorial. We've learned that not only do the parents' genes get shuffled around in the process of meiosis, that there's other complications, that there's something called the crossing over process in which there's a swapping before the swapping even happens, so to speak. So before, if you think of this as shuffling a deck of cards, you have two decks of cards, one from one from your one from each biological parent, and before you even shuffle the deck, they'll trade a few cards around, the crossing over, and then shuffle into a new combination of genetics. My point here is that most, especially when we get to human genetic reproduction, these things are really complex, and most of our traits are very complexly determined. I got very interested in this dimples thing because when I was growing up in school, I was told that there are all kinds of things that were dominant or recessive. I was told that brown eyes were dominant. Turns out that's not so simple. Dominant, but not exactly because it's multifactorial. Black hair? Maybe. There's a lot of people with black hair in the world for sure, but it's, again, a multifactorial thing. And even dimples. It turns out that your textbook says these are straight up dominant and recessive, but it's weird because they're not determined by just one gene. There's multiple genes. AI says so. Now, I've looked this up. This is just the overview, so I don't have to give you a bunch of text. And they can sometimes be present at first and then disappear as you get older, or you can develop them as you get older. They're known as an irregular dominant trait. Most things in humans, even including something as simple as dimples, are really complicated and don't necessarily follow this pattern. Natural selection, you've all heard of it. But I just want to emphasize that in order to have something to select from, you need to have variation or diversity. If every child from a parent looked the same, if everybody was tall or short in your family, if they all came out medium height, then there wouldn't be any variation. There would be nothing to select from. There wouldn't be anything for natural selection to work on. So part of the variation just comes from sexual reproduction, these complex processes of meiosis, crossing over and weird combinations, and things just happen. There are mutations all the time. Mutations are just a part of life. Most mutations don't really do anything. They're just weird copying attributes because they have to make all those proteins reproduce. Most mutations don't really have an effect. They're just going on. People don't realize how much mutation is going on all the time, and most of it doesn't really matter. It's little bits here and there. These mutations come up, but every so often there are things that change things in more dramatic ways. So let's say I'm walking along and there's a mutation in the next generation, and my kid gets slightly lighter skin than I have. Is that good or bad? Advantageous or disadvantageous? The point is that if a trait is going to be advantageous or not, it depends on where it is. Something that mutates and gives you lighter or darker skin might be good in one environment and bad in another environment. And honestly, in today's world, completely neutral because we should all be wearing sunscreen and we can all take vitamin D pills if we need to. So now it doesn't matter so much. In the old days, it might have mattered a little more if you need to maximize your vitamin D absorption or minimize your sun exposure. So whether a mutation or a trait is advantageous or subject to natural selection always depends on the environment. Also, what do we know about the natural environment? The environment is always changing. And the changes we are experiencing today are nothing as compared to what's been happened in the last million, 2 million, 3 million years or so. So the environment is changing and the traits are going to be advantageous or not within a given environment. The other thing that we might want to think about is the idea of what fitness means. So we tend to think of fitness as I'm a fit person. I've been exercising, I'm healthy, I can play sports, and that's going to give me an evolutionary advantage. But let's say I am a very fit triathlete. I've been training and I'm all healthy and I'm all cool. I'm one of the most fit human beings alive, but for reasons of my own making, I don't have any kids. What's my evolutionary fitness score? This fitness score is 0. It hasn't done anything. So I might be a triathlete. I might look super good. I might have dimples and dark hair and be very attractive. But if I don't have offspring, my fitness is 0. So in evolutionary terms, they use this in a very different way than we do in everyday life. We sometimes use a phrase that Darwin borrowed from Herbert Spencer to describe evolution as survival of the fittest. That is a weird idea in evolutionary terms because one, we don't know what the fitness is going to be in different environments in terms of advantageous and disadvantageous. And two, evolutionary fitness just means I can reproduce more. or I've been able to reproduce more. A lot of the traits that we think of must be rooted in evolutionary biology turn out to be almost impossible. The other thing about evolution is lots of random stuff happens. So lots of random stuff happens in terms of how your genetics are passed on and whether you're going to have dimples or not, how your environment changes all the time, and whether you're tall or short. There's just a lot of random stuff that goes on, but there's also things that happen with populations. So sometimes a population will drift off from another, or there'll be a certain people who will move away from a different population and maybe go to an island. And then they start reproducing there on that island, and they don't have a lot of gene flow or interconnectedness with the rest of the population. And just because of the random assortment of people who have moved there, there might be some genes that get in higher concentration in that area. And that's called founder effect. We also have the idea of genetic bottlenecking, where a population might get stuck in a certain area. There's not necessarily reason for it, but certain traits get concentrated in that area. Lots of random stuff happens. For human beings, one of the most important thing here is gene flow. As I mentioned, we have been one interbreeding, interconnected species for 100,000 years or so. And we, as far distant and as far apart as we've gotten from each other, and as much as some people have gone to islands and reproduced there, we have never lost this ability to reproduce amongst ourselves. And that is true in the past, and it is certainly true in the present. There is zero probability that, or there's a very, very tiny probability that there's ever going to be people evolving into different species or subspecies within the human population. The current abundance of gene flow, what that means is people mixing up and getting together with each other all over the world, which I've said has been true for 100,000 years, even though people grow apart. There were times when subpopulations, maybe the Neanderthals or the Denisovans, may have been considered separate species or subspecies. So there were different bipedal primates around. But at this time, we are the only bipedal primate or hominin left, and there is exceedingly low possibility that we are evolving into separate species that cannot reproduce with each other. Animals and people are always changing, and the frequencies of our genes and our teeth and our this and our that are always going to be changing over time. But the question is, are we dividing into different subspecies or different species? No, we are not. We are still reproducing with each other crazy like. Now, there are some people who do want to slow down this gene flow and reproduction. You may have heard of them. They're trying to clamp down on human beings, trying to put people into boxes. And people are often making laws. They have in the past made laws about people, they called miscegenation laws, that you can't get married to a person of a so-called different race. But the thing is, people have always either broken the law or broken the rules. They are always getting together with other people, even though they might look different. Our gene flow continues in human history. It's always been there. Now, when it comes to human variation and what we see among human beings, most of the variation that we see is, to use another biological term, clinal. And what that means is that it is gradual along a range or along a path. So sometimes when we get people together who come from different geographical areas, they might look very different. But if you walked between those places where they come from, you would most likely see a gradual variation in traits. Things like skin color vary gradually as you move north to south in the indigenous populations to those areas. And things like eye form, eye shape vary gradually as you move east to west. Your textbook gives you an example of something that is, we can sample blood type, although we don't see it visibly. And it gives you an example of the percentage of the population which has type O blood. And obviously, in certain regions of the world, and these are generally taken from the populations that are considered to be indigenous to those, so the people who would have lived there before people started moving around more and more on boats and airplanes. But there is no population of the world that is entirely lacking in, say, or where everyone is type O. And there's no population of the world in which you can say, I have this trait, I now know where you're from. All of these things vary gradually over a geographical range, and there are percentages of people in each population. When we look genetically at the human species, even though different local populations get different traits clumped up in them, 85% of the genetic variation in the world is within any local population. So if you went to any village, any city in the world, that population contains 85% of the genetic variation. And what we clump people into, the traits that we call, the groups that we call races, there is more biological difference, genetic, physical, within the groups that we call a race than between them. So if you look at all the white people in the room, there's going to be more difference in height, weight, physical differences within the group than there is between groups like white, black, Asian, however many races you want to divide up. There's always going to be more variation within these groups than there are between them. And there's no characteristic that you can say marks off one group definitively from another. Most of the traits that we have, like skin color, ears, hair form, lips, noses, vary gradually. And if you lined everybody up in the world, there's no dividing line between the people of the darker skin colors and the people of the lighter skin colors. Your textbook gives you the example of Dr. Jada Ben Torres, who is from Trinidad. In the United States, we saw Dr. Ben Torres walking down the street or in our classroom. Most of the people in the United States would classify her as black. I'll just say that. That's probably what we'd say. But if you look at her actual ancestry and what she's researching in, she has West African ancestry, European ancestry, stuff from the indigenous peoples that were in the Caribbean, some Indian ancestry, and some East Asian ancestry. They're all mixed together. The United States, in general, we try to shove people into 2 or 3 categories. But most people's genetics and their ancestry is much more complicated than that, and it has been for years. As I mentioned, Dr. Ben Torres is from this country that combines 2 small islands, Trinidad and Tobago, just off the coast of Venezuela in the Caribbean. These are some places that you may have heard about on the news. Venezuela, or Trinidad and Tobago, we usually don't hear that much about them, but there they are. First oil producers, by the way. Puerto Rico, may have heard about them. Oh, U.S. territory, the island of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba. There we are, the Florida up there in the United States. These were some of the first places that were colonized by the Europeans. This is the area that Columbus and others were running around. Dr. Ben Torres's ancestry is very typical of this region and has been for hundreds of years. I had the chance to go to Puerto Rico in January. And while we're there, we're touring these areas where the Spanish had built forts long before New York City or any place. Puerto Rico was hugely important to the whole mission of colonizing and getting a hold of the Americas. People were brought there On every voyage that Columbus and other people took, there were also Africans who were taken there because there were already Africans in Spain and Portugal. They were in the Americas from the beginning. There were indigenous people in the Caribbean who they were exploiting, but also intermingling with. There later on, there were people brought from China to work in Cuba and various Caribbean islands. The enslavement trade brought many, many more people from Africa, and then also people from India into different islands, especially Trinidad and Tobago. From India, people were brought there into this area. For hundreds of years, people have been mixing it up in these areas. This is not atypical of the world. The typical thing to do is to have these kinds of interactions and mixed upness. Now, in the United States, some white people, when they talk about race mixture, their head explodes. Recently, a bunch of white people, their heads exploded. They remember? The Super Bowl. Man, this drove people nuts. But Bad Bunny is just doing the typical thing. Puerto Rico is a U.S. place. They're all U.S. citizens. This is not just the new thing. This is the thing that's been going on for 500 years. People have been mixing it up in the Caribbean. Every ship that Columbus sailed had Africans on it, and they were trying to get to Asia. So this is not just the future, it's the present and it is also the past. By the way, does anybody know why the Europeans were trying to drag so many people from Africa and then later people from China and people from India into these small islands? Yes, they were enslaved. This little island of Hispaniola, which later became Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that small place received more African enslaved people than the entire United States. The island of Jamaica got more African enslaved people than the whole United States. Why? Yeah, what was the biggest mover of people in human history? Far more than cotton that we usually think about in the United States. Way more. Yes, it was sugar cane. And it was some of the most brutal labor that you could possibly do. But that was the thing that made these places so valuable. And that's why they kept importing so much labor. Again, much more than the place that would become the United States. When Bad Bunny starts off with people in the sugar cane in the Super Bowl, he's not just doing it because it was a good crop. This is a history lesson. Millions of people were moved across the world, most of them to cut sugar cane, which would then be processed and sent back or sent into other places to make sweet drinks and give calories to people when they needed it. The modern notion of what race is and why people should have to work and do these things has a lot to do with this history of sugar cane and sugar production and how sugar went from being this very small luxury good to something that everybody needed in their coffee, tea, and eventually other beverages.